My shirt says, "My tummy hurts, but I'm being really brave about it." Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you don't know me, my name is Nina. I'm a certified life coach, and last year I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease, and I want to talk about my journey with it so far because it's been one hell of a ride. So I'm going to be sharing my Crohn's disease story in two parts. This video, I'm going to be talking all about the diagnosis, which was a 10-year process, so buckle up. And then tomorrow I'll be posting the video where I talk about the past year essentially of having Crohn's, my journey with treatment. So the purpose in me wanting to share this story, share my story with Crohn's, is for a couple of reasons. This is a disease that I find has a lot of stigma or embarrassment surrounding it. So I know that it can be lonely to have this disease. So if you're out there and you have Crohn's as well, hopefully you can find some relatability in my story. Of course, I am just sharing my story. This by no means is me telling you what you should do. So don't take anything that I say here as medical advice. And if you don't have Crohn's disease and you've stumbled across this video, maybe from my other channel, you're curious about what's been going on with me as far as my diagnosis, then hopefully this can act to spread some more awareness about this disease. Because along with the stigma and the embarrassment, I also find that there are a lot of misconceptions about Crohn's. So let's first start off with what is Crohn's disease. Crohn's disease is an autoimmune illness. A lot of people in my anecdotal experience, have in their mind that Crohn's and IBS is one and the same. It's definitely not. In an autoimmune illness like Crohn's, the immune system attacks healthy tissue for no apparent reason. And in the case of Crohn's and another inflammatory bowel disease called ulcerative colitis, the autoimmune system is interpreting the GI tract as a foreign invader and attacking healthy tissue, causing chronic and acute inflammation and ulcers. The difference between Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis is a couple of things, mainly the location of the inflammation and the ulcers. Ulcerative colitis is contained to the large intestine, the colon, whereas Crohn's can happen anywhere in the GI tract from the mouth to the anus. And ulcerative colitis also happens continuously. So if you have ulcerative colitis in one portion of your colon, it will spread continuously. Whereas Crohn's disease can happen, for lack of a better word, in patches. It doesn't spread, and I don't know that spread is even the right word, continuously. Like I said, it can happen anywhere from the mouth to the anus, but it's not necessarily going to happen all the way through the GI tract. Like you can have patches of Crohn's disease in your small intestine and then some unaffected portions of your GI tract, and then Crohn's disease affecting your large intestine or your mouth, but not necessarily continuously. But both Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis are different forms of IBD, inflammatory bowel disease, which I know sounds similar to IBS. There's only one letter difference, but there's actually only one word in common when you break down the acronym of each. IBD is inflammatory bowel disease, and IBS is irritable bowel syndrome. So the only thing that they have in common is bowel. While IBD is an inflammatory condition, IBS just shows a sensitivity in the gut. And while IBD is a disease, a chronic condition that currently there is no cure for, IBS is a syndrome. It just happens. Because in the layperson, IBS and IBD can be equated as one and the same, my experience is that a lot of people will assume that someone's Crohn's disease has to do with their lifestyle, that they essentially are to blame for the Crohn's disease, that it's something that they're eating, that they can cure the disease with lifestyle changes. While yes, lifestyle factors can definitely keep Crohn's and colitis at bay, it's also not a one-size-fits-all. Different people have different trigger foods, and lifestyle factors will not address the root of the disease, which is an autoimmune response. Like I said, I'm going to be doing 2 parts to my Crohn's disease story. Today we're going to be talking about the diagnosis, and then the next video will be talking about my journey with treatment and the emotional toll of all of that. So I just want to say that this is a very sensitive topic for me, so if you're coming here from my other channel, or if for some reason you are not someone who has Crohn's disease, please be kind in the comments. This is a sensitive issue for me and a lot of other people who struggle with Crohn's disease, and I'm also not looking for advice as to what I should do with my Crohn's disease. I also need to make the disclaimer, if you're not prepared for it or didn't assume already, I'm going to be talking very candidly about bodily functions. So if that's not something that you're interested in hearing, we're going to be talking about the gnarly stuff that can happen with Crohn's disease. So be prepared. Like I said, it was a 10-year process for me to get officially diagnosed with Crohn's disease. So this story starts in 2012. In the summer of 2012, I was a rising high school sophomore. I was 15 years old, and the primary symptom that I began experiencing at that time was actually not a symptom that was all that bizarre to me, not all that uncommon for me. In the prior 15 years leading up to this point, I was essentially very constipated. I did not have frequent bowel movements at all. And it got to the point where I was so blocked up, I was maybe having a bowel movement once every 3 days. And so obviously there was a lot of strain and discomfort when I would have a bowel movement. And that's when I developed a fissure and I began seeing blood in my stool. I was not all that concerned, honestly, with the fact that I was very backed up and constipated. In fact, I saw it as a blessing because I did not like going to the bathroom in public places. And I saw it as a blessing that I didn't have to do that all that often, pretty much ever. I could definitely hold it in until I was in a place where I was comfortable to use the bathroom. And particularly in the summer of 2012, I was doing this sort of like Habitat for Humanity type of volunteer project in West Virginia, and we were staying in a church in sleeping bags on the floor. And honestly, the church bathroom facilities were not ideal, and especially because whenever I would have a bowel movement, it would be kind of an ordeal. It would be strained. I would spend a lot of time in there. I did not want to be doing that in a public restroom with a lot of other people around. So I was like, whoa, I feel really lucky that I started this trip on a Sunday and I didn't have to have a bowel movement until Wednesday, which is not healthy. But when I started seeing the blood in my stool, I went to good old Dr. Google. And just from a little bit of Googling, I was able to discern that the blood in my stool was not necessarily like the most concerning. It was bright red instead of dark. It was sort of streaked on the stool instead of coming out in clots or coming out as loose blood in the bowl. But nevertheless, Dr. Google told me to tell my doctor if I was experiencing such a thing. And so I told my mom, who was not a doctor, but I was a child. And when my mom heard this, she made an appointment for me with a GI specialist. And this whole experience of like dealing with these symptoms at this point in my life, I really did not think it was a big deal. And I was sort of embarrassed about like even bringing attention to it. And the people around me also were, I think, trying to like keep me calm, not have me worry about what might be going on with me. And so I got the sense from my parents and the doctors around me that it wasn't actually that big of a deal. But immediately after having my first consultation with a GI, she scheduled a colonoscopy for me. And in hearing other people's stories with Crohn's disease, I think that that's not necessarily a very common course of action. I've heard a lot of people say that they weren't taken seriously when they first started having Crohn's symptoms. And this was definitely not even the tip of the iceberg of the Crohn's symptoms that I would experience in the future. But I've heard a lot of people getting written off for their symptoms in the beginning, really needing to advocate for themselves to have the testing to be diagnosed with Crohn's. But it was pretty immediate that I got scheduled in for a colonoscopy. The reason for that, I think, is my family history. As far as I know, no one in my family has Crohn's disease or any type of IBD, but my grandfather at this point had passed away about 3 years before this. And there's also someone in my immediate family who has a different autoimmune disease. So I think that they were screening for Crohn's or colitis at that point, although that was not communicated to me. I didn't even know at this point in my life that there was someone in my immediate family who had an autoimmune disease. And because nothing of that nature was communicated to me, I was under the impression that I was getting screened for colon cancer. I was like, okay, this is a bit dramatic. I'll go along with it, but I'm 15 years old. I don't have colon cancer. And I felt ashamed. I felt like I was being dramatic because I had brought this up, and now all of these, in my view at the time, drastic measures were being taken that I interpreted as dramatic. So what the colonoscopy found at that time in 2012 was that I had aphytus ulcers in my terminal ileum. So my colon, which I thought, was the primary concern, was completely fine, completely healthy. And the terminal ileum, as I understand it, is sort of like the last point that they can reach in a colonoscopy. It's the very end of the small intestine. And what they found there were aphytus ulcers, which are essentially canker sores. Same thing that you will experience in your mouth. I experienced a lot of canker sores as a child. I don't know if you can relate if you have Crohn's. So it's definitely not as severe of an ulcer to be experiencing. Now, the aphytus ulcers in my small intestine definitely were not to blame for the blood in my stool. The blood in my stool, it was determined, came from a fissure, which likely came from straining from constipation. And a fissure is a tear. So what was the conclusion with the findings of aphytus ulcers in my terminal ileum? Looking back with what I have learned about Crohn's since then, I'm surprised that at that point I wasn't diagnosed with Crohn's disease. Now, granted, my symptoms were not necessarily very severe. I was frequently nauseous, kind of like throughout my whole life. Like, nausea was something that I experienced quite often, and indigestion was not uncommon for me. So because I kind of like experienced that sort of my whole life, it wasn't something that, again, I took very seriously at that point. Of course, it was unpleasant, but it was relatively mild, especially compared to what I would experience in the future. But aphytus ulcers in the small intestine are definitely a marker for Crohn's. But the conclusion that my GI made at the time, and my GI at the time was literally on the verge of retiring, which I think affected how my case was handled. She sort of said to my mom, who didn't communicate this to me at the time, it could be Crohn's, it could not be. I don't really want to put her on medication right now. It was kind of left at that, and I was none the wiser. I ended up having one follow-up appointment with a nutritionist who told me that I needed to eat more fiber. because of my constipation, and I was living at home and not in charge of my meals at the time. I was eating at the cafeteria at school, not in charge of my meals. So basically what I did to get more fiber is I would eat like a couple of handfuls of berries every day, which is actually not really recommended for Crohn's. The common wisdom, it seems, when it comes to diet in a Crohn's flare is a low residue diet. So nothing that would have like seeds, like berries or whole grains, stuff that is high residue in that way that could irritate the GI tract when it's inflamed. But that is what I took away from the one appointment with the nutritionist that I had. And then I had one appointment with, I think, what was a naturopath. All I remember from that appointment is that she had like a yoga ball desk chair. I think she was pregnant. The weird things that my brain fixates on. And she asked me if I was stressed, and I broke down crying. And then she told me to take rhodiola rosea. That was that. And from my GI herself, I was prescribed an over-the-counter laxative, Miralax, which literally had no effect on me, and some heartburn medication. And it was just sort of the case where I didn't think any of this was a big deal. No one was acting to me like it was a big deal. The symptoms were something that were not uncommon for me my entire life. The only reason that any of this got brought up was because there was blood in my stool from the fissure, and no one really followed up with me to see how I was doing, and I was not advocating for myself because I didn't think anything that I was experiencing was a big deal. And so I went through the Miralax, it had no effect on me. I went through the heartburn medication, it didn't really improve anything to my recollection. I went through the rhodiola rosea bottle, and after a while I dropped off of even eating a couple of handfuls of blackberries a day. So for the next 4 years, from 2012 to 2016, I would just deal with the same sort of low-grade symptoms. I did not have frequent bowel movements. I was frequently nauseous. I experienced indigestion also very frequently after meals, but I had no concept that I was even at risk for Crohn's disease. I was aware that Crohn's disease was a thing because I remember thinking like, God help me, I do not want to have that, because it's such an ugly name, you know? Like, I know that Crohn's was named after some guy whose last name was Crohn's, but I thought of like an old crone, an old hag, and I was like, I do not want to be associated with that at all. But what changed for me in 2016 is that I actually went vegan. I didn't go vegan necessarily for my health. I was emboldened to go vegan for animal rights. But, and I know that this is not necessarily the case for everyone, I had amazing health results from going vegan. In 2016, I was in college. I was living on my own. I did not live in dorms. I lived in an apartment. My school did not have on-campus housing, on-campus cafeteria. So I was completely in charge of my meals. And that's why I decided to go vegan, because it was something that I was passionate about, and it was something that was not really available to me as long as I wasn't in charge of what was in my fridge living at home. And I tell you, like, when I went vegan, I literally could not shut up about my bowel movements. Like, nobody wanted to hear about how great my digestion had improved, but I could not stop telling people because it was such a game changer for me to have frequent bowel movements that were not painful, that were not an ordeal. Like, literally such a game changer to know that if I needed to use the bathroom, that it would be quick, that it would be inconspicuous that it would be not painful. I also was not experiencing that low-grade constant nausea or indigestion after meals. My relationship with food, just in general, improved tremendously going vegan. I had more appetite. I had more love for food. I had more joy in the process of eating. And my energy improved, my mental focus. Throughout my life, always struggled with energy, with feeling like I had a lot of energy and that I could exert a lot of energy. And that improved a lot once I went vegan. So it was a great decision for me. Could not shut up about how frequent and amazing my bowel movements were to anyone who would listen, and told everyone to go vegan. Obviously, that's a big thing that vegans do. And I would just say, like, go vegan. You don't even know like what it has done for my digestion. I know that a lot of people, when they first go vegan, they report having a lot of gas and bloating, and that was the opposite for me. Like, I was loving it. And I'm still vegan, by the way. A lot of people, when I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease or dealing with Crohn's disease, a lot of people who are not doctors, mind you, were like, you have to go back to eating meat, you have to go back to eating animal products, which is just stupid. In my opinion, and my doctors don't agree that I need to stop being vegan. So that's what matters. Of course, the vegan diet has a lot more fiber, so obviously that would improve my constipation. And in general, meat and animal products are more difficult to digest for humans because our intestinal tract is so long. It takes, from my understanding, a lot of effort to break down those really dense foods like meat and dairy and eggs. So my digestion was really happy with me going vegan. My energy focus was really happy with me going vegan. I have a couple of hypotheses as to what veganism did for me in my Crohn's journey. So, like I said, I am kind of surprised looking back that I wasn't diagnosed with Crohn's in 2012 when they found the aphthous ulcers in my TI. But at the very least, I was like highly at risk for developing Crohn's. And given my experience, I think that going vegan either put me into some form of remission from this mild Crohn's that I was experiencing, or it kept the further developing of Crohn's symptoms at bay and prolonged the fact that I would eventually develop full-blown Crohn's. But even with my digestion being very good as I went vegan, about 4 years leading up to not my Crohn's diagnosis, but my onset of Crohn's symptoms post being vegan, I was experiencing a lot of what in hindsight I realized were Crohn's co-morbidities. A lot of unexplained health issues that didn't have any rhyme or reason, but that looking back with a quick Google search, all are shown to be comorbidities that can go along with Crohn's. Because as Crohn's is an autoimmune inflammatory illness, it doesn't just affect the GI system. It primarily affects the GI system, but there are other issues that come along with it. And it is common for people who later get diagnosed with Crohn's to begin experiencing Crohn's symptoms 5 years leading up to that diagnosis. And now I did not, like, my digestional symptoms literally happened overnight when I got this like full-blown Crohn's. But the comorbidities that I was experiencing is that I had very severe eczema on my hands specifically. And of course, like, I should say that all of these comorbidities on their own do not necessarily indicate Crohn's or a autoimmune illness of any kind. But in hindsight and piecing all of them together, it does seem that that was the root of the cause of me experiencing all of these things. So I had severe eczema on my hands. I had something that like truly no one could explain why I had this issue. It's called costochondritis. It's essentially very intense rib and chest pain caused by the inflammation of the cartilage connecting the rib bones to the chest bone. It's apparently the number one reason that people go to the hospital thinking that they have a heart attack when they're not actually having a heart attack. So it's very painful. And any doctor that I would go to would be like, this usually happens in people who are like recovering from intense car accidents or physical trauma. And along with the rib pain, with the costochondritis, I had some other sort of like joint pain, which is a common comorbidity with Crohn's or I believe other autoimmune illnesses. And a quick Google search did show that costochondritis can be associated with Crohn's disease. So also a very well-known comorbidity of Crohn's disease is dry eyes. And I but leading up to my Crohn's disease, I had chronically dry eyes. I would get these like crazy styes. I had a sty, I named him Stanley, who lasted 6 weeks on my eyelid. I also have always struggled with, I don't know why I'm more embarrassed to say this than literally talking at length about my bowel movements, but I've always struggled with dandruff. And I would go to like the dermatologist and be like, help me out with this dandruff. They would give me shampoo upon shampoo and even oral medications. Literally like nothing would work. So much to the point that like I went through every single option that the dermatologist had for me, and then he forgot what he had already like given me and put me on a protocol for something that I had already tried and had not worked. And then he was like, I literally don't know what to do with you then. But a quick Google search again shows that apparently there is a correlation between Crohn's disease and dandruff, in that the dandruff that you find in your scalp can also be simultaneously present in the gut and be related to Crohn's disease. Again, I am not a doctor, and all of these findings on these comorbidities relating to Crohn's literally happen in one Google search, top result. Like, didn't even have to click anything. It's like when you do that Google search and they're like, we already know what you're asking, and we're just gonna put at the top of the screen a highlighted portion from where this is most relevant in an article. And I'm like, awesome. This is very validating. Thank you. So this again is all leading up to when I would begin experiencing digestional issues again for the first time in 5 years. I went vegan when I was 19. I didn't have any digestional issues aside from like a stomach bug maybe once in that whole time, until I was 24. And the digestional issues literally just hit me out of the blue. I can tell you the day, it was August 30th of 2021. And the only thing that I can like assume would have been the trigger for this, and I don't think it's necessarily a very strong argument because the timing doesn't really align, but I was on antibiotics in July of 2021, also like taking probiotics, and summer of 2021 was the summer of kombucha for me. So I was, consuming a lot of probiotics in general. And I remember at like the beginning of August 2021, I had some bad hummus, but it was kind of strange that there was some distance between all of those events and when I actually just like out of the blue began experiencing bad indigestion. The only other thing that makes more sense with the timeline would be very severe emotional stress at the time. I remember the day that my Crohn's kicked up. I was spending the whole day with my best friend. We got ice cream and spent the day at Laguna Beach. And you're like, excuse me, why is this severe emotional stress? The reason why that happened to be such a stressful day for me is because of the relationship that I was at the time. Doing something like that, spending the whole day out with a friend, and mind you, I was like texting and keeping up to date and always keeping my partner at the time in the loop of where we were going and what we were doing. He was a very controlling person, and I would definitely get punished for doing something like that, like spend the whole day with my friend, living life and being free. And of course, that was not isolated to that very day. It just happened to be a particularly bad, emotional, stressful time because that day just like brought out a lot of his worst behaviors. But it was a buildup of a lot of stress from that relationship over like 3 years at that point. Crohn's and other autoimmune illnesses can be stress induced. So that's another factor into why my Crohn's might have sprung up on me at this point in my life. At this point, I was actually seeing a naturopath very frequently for my costochondritis, doing lots of blood tests and taking lots of supplements and whatnot to troubleshoot it, if you will. And it just so happened that as I was under her care, I started experiencing chronic indigestion, just like nausea, upset stomach, abdominal pain. And so I brought it up with her and we began troubleshooting for that. This is a point at which it would have been very beneficial to know that a doctor had at one point pre-diagnosed me or whatever, had suspected that I had Crohn's. I had no idea of this at the time. Knowledge, information is power, ladies and gentlemen, and I did not have that knowledge or information, but I was having this chronic indigestion and nausea, and then I began experiencing a different kind of blood in my stool. It was not seemingly caused by a fissure where it would be bright red and streaked on the stool. It was bowls full and clots of blood coming out with bowel movements. I was not experiencing constipation in this manifestation of my Crohn's. I was experiencing a lot of diarrhea. I would sit on the toilet and my legs would be uncontrollably shaking. It was so bad. And everything was essentially like 10 times worse than what I had experienced 10 years prior. I was trying to figure this out with my naturopath. I was taking all sorts of supplements. I was doing blood tests. I was doing stool tests. The stool tests, I did 3, and they progressively got worse. What do you know? I was coming back with high inflammatory markers and severe dysbiosis, which is disruption in the gut microbiome. Something that they will check for in stool samples when trying to diagnose Crohn's, and also what my naturopath was checking for, because as a naturopath, functional medicine, holistic doctor, she checked for everything under the sun. An important factor for me was calprotectin. So calprotectin is an inflammatory marker that is highly elevated in Crohn's patients. Like I said, I did 3 stool tests. For the first 2 stool tests, I was not yet in like the red zone. I had borderline problematic values of calprotectin. When it comes to calprotectin, you want in a healthy cohort something lower than 50. A borderline value of calprotectin would be something like 80 to 120, I believe. And in the first 2 stool samples that I did, I had a value of like 87 calprotectin and like 117 calprotectin. So because it was a borderline value, my naturopath was still like, I'm gonna try some other things for you before referring you to a GI. And let's see, timeline wise, these issues started popping up at the very end of August, let's just say September of 2021. I would say that December of 2021 is when things became much worse. That is, I believe, when the blood in my stool was consistent, chronic, every day, a lot, big clots, bad vibes, and I was having more anal pain. January 2022 is when I did my second stool test, and I think that's when my naturopath said, I think it's time that you make an appointment with a GI. And so I did, and I had my little list that my naturopath said, make sure that you tell all of these things to your GI. So I talked about my elevated calprotectin. I was having also, with the nausea, I was having an increased gag reflex. And then obviously I told her my history of having found aphthous ulcers in my terminal ileum when I was 15. And my GI in LA was very animated. When I told her all of these things, every single thing that I said, she would be like, what? What do you mean? You have elevated calprotectin? You have aphthous ulcers when you were 15? Oh my God, she was like very animated. Immediately, we need to book a colonoscopy for you. Your history, your family history, all of that is bad news. At that point, I had become aware that someone in my immediate family had an autoimmune illness. Obviously, I had the history of colon cancer in my family, and then I had my own personal history. So she was like, we need to screen you for Crohn's and colitis. And I was like, oh, okay, I've heard of those things before. I was still in immense pain and experiencing like very problematic symptoms, but I didn't know like how serious things could get. I think because I had already been through the process of like having a colonoscopy and having everything resolve on its own, I didn't understand the severity of what a Crohn's or colitis diagnosis would mean for me. I didn't understand even that these were chronic conditions. And so I was like, cool, first available colonoscopy, which was about like 2 months from the point of my initial consultation with my GI. And in the meantime, I also did a stool test for her. So the third stool test that I did was for my GI, not my naturopath. And another thing to like keep in mind is that I was in a very toxic relationship. And so that really affected my mental state as far as being able to feel validated in my pain, feel supported. A very validating thing for me is when I heard the results of my third stool test. Like I said, my first stool tests showed borderline values of calprotectin, 87 and then 117. At the point of my third stool test, my calprotectin level was 693. So things were progressing very rapidly, and they would continue to. I have a pathological need to prove that I can power through anything. So while I was going through all of these Crohn's symptoms and leading up to my colonoscopy, I also was planning and executing a cross-country move. So I was living on the West Coast at the time and planning and executing a whole move to the East Coast. So to give you an idea of the timeline, my colonoscopy was on March 14th of 2022, and my flight to move back to the East Coast was on March 17th of 2022. March 14th was a Monday, March 17th was a Thursday. So leading up to this crunch time, I was selling all of my furniture on Facebook Marketplace. I was packing up all of my stuff and shipping it off to my parents' house so that they could take care of it for me while I didn't have a place to live. Meanwhile, I was working the same. I know this channel is very small, but I have another YouTube channel that I've had for 3 years. I was doubling the amount of content that I was creating so that I could like pre-film for the couple of weeks as I was doing the colonoscopy and the move and whatnot. On the day of my bowel prep, which is the most unpleasant part of a colonoscopy, where you are not allowed to eat for the whole day, and then you have to take a bunch of laxatives to clear out your digestive tract. On that day, when I wasn't allowed to eat, I was literally like moving furniture to clear it out of my apartment and give it to the people who had bought it on Facebook Marketplace. Like literally moving my couch in an apartment that didn't have an elevator on a day that I wasn't allowed to eat. The colonoscopy itself, the prep sucks. We all know that. The prep sucks, especially like when you have really bad Crohn's symptoms. I have the experience of having done the prep and having done a colonoscopy when my symptoms were more mild, and then having done the prep and the colonoscopy at essentially the peak of my Crohn's disease. And that second time was really, really awful. I remember that when I would get up from using the bathroom during the bowel prep, I literally had to like hunch over because I was in so much pain. And that was a moment as I was like looking at myself in the mirror, like hunched over. I was like, this is why they call it Crohn's disease, because I thought that I looked like an old hag Crohn, like hunched over like that. My mom had come to help me with my move, so she was staying with me. And so I was like hunched over like a Crohn. And I was like, this is why it must be called Crohn's disease. I didn't yet know that I had Crohn's disease, but I knew that this was a possibility. And this was evidence enough for me that I had Crohn's disease. And she was like, no, you silly, silly girl. It was named after a guy called Crohn's and it's spelled differently. And I was like, wow, that is very unsatisfying information because to me, it made a lot of sense. So I go in for my second colonoscopy, freshly turned 25, best sleep of my life. I, in general, have such a hard time falling asleep. So to me, I know that getting a colonoscopy is always a treat for at least the fact that it will take me that amount of time to drop into a good nap. I wake up from the colonoscopy and it's not a pleasant experience. I don't remember what the experience was like waking up from my first colonoscopy, but I woke up alone. Well, not alone, but no one that I knew was around there, and there was like barely a curtain like keeping me private at all from like a bunch of other people who had woken up from different procedures. I had my colonoscopy done at like a special surgery center. So people were there for all different sorts of surgery, and I woke up with all of the rest of them. And then a nurse noticed that I was awake, and she was like, oh, I'll let your doctor know that you're awake, and she'll like come in and tell you what they found. And that took such a long time, and it was so cold in there, and there was this old guy next to me, and he was like, what are you in for, kid? And I was like, I got a colonoscopy. And he was like, you look too young to have colon cancer. And I was like, see, even old people think that colonoscopy is just a screen for colon cancer. So it took a long while, and my doctor didn't actually end up coming in to see me. I ended up getting ushered to like a landline phone where my doctor was like, oh, you're still here. So I think that you have Crohn's. What they found was that I had chronic and acute inflammation throughout my GI system, and I had ulcers big boy ulcers this time, in my TI, in my terminal ileum, as well as in my rectum, which I think accounts for the bleeding that I was experiencing. It's like, I think that you have an autoimmune disease called Crohn's, but we took some biopsies and we're gonna send them off to the lab to rule out an infection, but I think you have Crohn's. And so I left, and then I proceeded to pack up the rest of my apartment for the next few days, and then I moved across the country. When I was staying with my parents while I was looking for a new place, my GI called me back at the end of the month and told me that the lab results were all negative for infection. So she diagnosed me officially with Crohn's disease over the phone, and then she told me a little bit about how we would proceed. And then I had to tell her, oh, I now live on the other side of the country. And she was like, oh, okay. Bye then. So she sent me all of my medical records for me to pursue treatment out where I'm living now. My Crohn's apparently is very typical. It's a very common place to have Crohn's in the TI, in the terminal ileum. The type of Crohn's that I have, because I have it in my terminal ileum and I also have it in my colon, in my rectum, it's called ileocolonic Crohn's, and it is moderate to severe, which apparently I thought that that was just like something that they said in like Humira commercials, like Humira helps you manage your moderate to severe ulcerative colitis or Crohn's. And I always thought like it can help you if you have moderate Crohn's, or it can help you if you have severe Crohn's. But apparently, according to my paperwork, I have moderate to severe Crohn's, like moderately severe, I guess. But my diagnosis story was long enough, so I will be back with another video to talk about what my journey has been with Crohn's since the diagnosis, which has been about a little over a year, and it has been quite a journey. I'm so shocked whenever I look on YouTube, like my Crohn's disease story, and I see like 14-minute long videos. I'm like, how? I just have so much to say, so much to talk about. So the takeaway from the diagnosis part of my story is that information is power. I really wish, even though I was a child, and I appreciate that the people in my life, my family, and my doctors were trying to keep me from being worried, were trying to protect me, and I guess like by virtue of that, I could have really easily like developed serious like health anxiety, and I don't have health anxiety, but sometimes that's been to my detriment, that I feel like I need to power through things that are very painful and very difficult and don't acknowledge my pain. So I hope that this video was beneficial to you in some way, whether you feel more aware of Crohn's, whether you feel more seen, validated, feel more comfortable with your Crohn's by knowing that you're not alone, or whether you feel more educated on what Crohn's can be, how it can look like. I will be back tomorrow, and if it's already uploaded by the time that you watch this, it should pop up right here for my part 2 of my Crohn's story, talking all about the treatment process that I've been through and where I'm at now. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe to this channel. It is a new channel that I plan to be putting out more content on in regards to chronic illness, as well as more insights and tools that I can empower you with through my coaching, as well as healing from some of the relationship issues that I touched on in this video that ended up being a part of my Crohn's story. But thank you so much for watching part 1 of my Crohn's disease story. I hope that you remember that you are not alone, and to give yourself grace as you're doing your best. Bye.